Thank you for having me tonight. And so I've been asked to talk a little bit about bats. That's my area of expertise. I am a bat expert, and specifically how the Endangered Species Act and the bats together might affect this project. So we're talking about creating a reservoir. Obviously, everybody knows what we're here about tonight. And really, as far as a biologist such as myself, when we talk about something like this, we're really talking about a disturbance. That's the ecological term. In ecology, disturbance is a temporary, although we could argue this might not be so temporary, change in the average environmental condition that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. So I think we can all understand what we're talking about there. These disturbances often act quickly with great effect and sometimes result in the removal of large amounts of biomass. And so that's really what we're talking about here, is how will this action change the ecosystem, and in my case, I'm interested mostly in the bats. Now, the effects of disturbance generally are temporary, and you can look at this in a couple different ways, and of course, temporary is a relative term. When we're in biology, we're often looking at thousands or tens or millions of years, and so certainly this change to us is not very temporary, and it doesn't fix itself quickly, but over ecological time, perhaps it could. So we're creating a reservoir. Really, the issue that we're looking at with regards to these animals, and it's not just bats, but that's the one I'm going to focus on tonight, is that riparian corridor. And riparian just means those habitats along the edge of a stream or along the edge of a river. And that obviously is going to be lost if we flood the river corridor. Flooding that habitat will actually destroy the habitat initially, but new riparian habitat will actually come up along the edges of this new reservoir and along the tributaries. So we'll lose some, but then we're going to gain some. The issue, though, is that it's going to take hundreds of years for that new habitat to get to the point that the current habitat is right now. Those sycamores that are 150 years old that are along the edge of the river, it took a long time for them to get there. It's going to take a long time for that new habitat to get to that same age. It will happen, but it's going to take a while. Now, historically, what would happen here is that this new habitat will be colonized by both plants and animals as it becomes of the right type and right age. Animals will now come in and recolonize that area. But of course, that makes two big assumptions. Those assumptions are that we have high-quality areas nearby to act as a source for these animals to come into this now new 100-year-old habitat. And the other big assumption, and this is the one I think that we're really going to deal with tonight, is that these organisms, the population of these organisms must be robust enough to tolerate the initial loss of the organisms during the flooding event, and then must be robust enough to be able to provide new individuals to come in, surplus individuals to come back in and recolonize at a later date. And that is where I think we come into conflict. So we're talking about bats, and in particular, there's a couple species that we'll get into here in a little bit, and of course, they could be, or in some cases are endangered, and so the Endangered Species Act of 1973 is what we're really talking about. And so in 1973, our country made the decision that our economic growth and our development was not important enough to allow us to eliminate a species from this planet. We decided that they have just as much of a right to be here as we do, and so we are going to stop ourselves from wiping out a species, hence the Endangered Species Act. This Endangered Species Act has many different sections, much like a chapter, and in particular, we're going to look at a couple of these different sections. We're going to look at Section 2, which is policy and just what it's about, definitions. Then we're going to look at how we cooperate with different groups, and then we're going to look at exceptions and how we might be able to get around this Endangered Species Act. So the first thing we're going to look at here is purpose. And so what is the purpose of the Endangered Species Act? I think you already know this, so we'll go through it really quickly. Basically, it is to protect the habitats that these species rely on, and it's also to protect the actual species themselves. And that includes both endangered and threatened animals. And I'm not going to go into the subtle differences between the two, but needless to say, both are protected under this act. We also have some key definitions that are important for us to understand. And I'm not going to read through all this, but basically the first definition says, what is a person? And that's important to understand because a person, as far as the Endangered Species Act, it means everybody. It means government agencies. It means individual people. It means groups, tribes, anything you can possibly imagine. There is no one that is exempt from the Endangered Species Act. The military is not exempt from the Endangered Species Act. Everybody falls under this umbrella. The second definition that I pulled out here is this term in the Endangered Species Act, which is really interesting, called take. To take an endangered species. It's weird. Obviously, we can't kill an endangered species, but the term take is much more broad than that. It includes, and I'll read it here, it means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, kill, wound, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to do any of those things. So if you bother an endangered species, you are in violation of the Endangered Species Act. You don't actually have to kill it, and that's an important thing to remember. What does this process go? How does this work with this Endangered Species Act? Well, what we're going to do is whenever there is what we call a nexus, which means a federal agency is involved, and clearly we have that because the Army Corps of Engineers is involved in this project, the airport may be having to be removed or moved, would mean the FAA is involved. So there's a number of federal agencies that will be involved in this reservoir project. So that means there's this nexus or this connection with agencies. They have to go to the Fish and Wildlife Service and say, hey, we got this project, what do you think? And that's informal consultation. And Fish and Wildlife will come back and they'll have a little conversation, could be email, could be a phone call, and they'll say, hey, we think there might be these species there may not be these species there. And based on those conversations, if they don't think there's an impact, then you're essentially done. Go forward, have a nice day, good luck. If they think there's going to be an impact and the project is now concerned about that possible impact and therefore a violation of the Endangered Species Act, then they have to enter into formal consultation. So the first stop we have to make here in Section 7 is, do we have any species that could possibly cause a problem? I give you the Indiana bat, federally endangered Indiana bat. It's been endangered since the beginning of the act back in the 70s. This animal lives in caves in the wintertime, but in the summertime, the females all get together and they form a maternity colony, and they do that in the woods, in the forest. And they really, really, really like mature forests along rivers. Sounds familiar, right? And so what they do is they get together, and it could be 100 or more females will get together, and you may not be able to see it, but there's a dead tree in this picture, and there's some dead bark up at the top, and they crawl up underneath that dead bark, all 50, 100 of them, and that is where they will live that summer, and they will raise their young. And so clearly, if you get rid of that kind of habitat, you would be impacting not just one, but many of these females that are reproducing. That would certainly be take. There is another bat called the northern long-eared bat, historically one of the most common bats that we have in the Midwest. I've caught thousands of them in my career. Unfortunately, due to a variety of different events, they are on the decline. October 2nd, 2013, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they proposed that the northern long-eared bat will be added to the endangered species list. Now it's gone through a whole bunch of rigmarole and public comment and a bunch of other stuff, but nonetheless, a final decision will be made on April 2nd, 2015. Their choices are obviously don't list it, it's not endangered, threatened, or endangered. I'm here to tell you that not listed is not an option. It's going to get listed. The debate is, will it get listed as threatened or endangered? For us, we don't care because the Endangered Species Act treats them the same as far as we're concerned. So we are going to have two different endangered species that have an extremely high likelihood, and I mean close to near 100% chance of being in this habitat area. So therefore, they will be affected by this project. So now we must enter formal consultation. When we enter formal consultation, we won't read through it, but basically, if Fish and Wildlife Service has to make a decision, will it likely adversely affect this species? And will it jeopardize this species? And if they decide that it does, boom, we're done. Discussion over. You can't bother these animals. You cannot impact them to the point where you are jeopardizing their existence, okay? So, you can get a permit to what we call an incidental take permit. I have an incidental take permit. I am allowed to go take endangered species. Now, I can't kill them, but I can go harass them. And I'm a wildlife biologist. I research bats. That's what I do. I harass bats. I go out and I catch these animals, and I put little tiny radio transmitters on them, and I follow them around the woods like some kind of weird stalker, and I follow them around, and I figure out where are they going and what are they doing. I'm doing that so we can understand the animal and preserve them. So I have a take permit. Now, we could get a take permit for the reservoir. if we didn't think it was going to jeopardize the species. If we're just going to bother a few or kill maybe one or two, we might be able to get an incidental take permit. But we have to make sure it doesn't actually jeopardize the species. So what does jeopardy mean? Well, the bold part is the important part here. It says an action is reasonably expected to directly or indirectly to diminish the species numbers, reproduction, or distribution to that, so that the likelihood of survival and recovery in the wild is appreciably reduced. There's a lot of vague words in there, but the point being is that if we think we are impacting this species enough that this is going to impact their ability to rebound and come back, then we have passed that jeopardy cutoff. If we have one maternity colony of 100 Indiana bats in that bottomland trying to raise young and we flood them out, that clearly would be jeopardy. If we have a few colonies of these northern long-eared bats that are reproducing in there and we're going to wipe those out, that would clearly be jeopardy. Now, I can't be the one that makes the decision of whether or not it's jeopardy or not, but I'm telling you that the scale is leaning really far towards the jeopardy side, in which case we really will not be able to move forward with the project if that's the case, if that's the decision that the Fish and Wildlife makes. And of course, it's their decision and it's a bunch of negotiation that goes along with that. So it would look like that the project wouldn't be able to move forward because of the Endangered Species Act. And make no joke about it, the Endangered Species Act it's written in stone. There is no bullying your way through the Endangered Species Act. There is no getting around it. It's pretty much insurpassable. If a decision is made, the decision is made. Now, there is an exemption. You can, if you decide we will jeopardize this species, but you know what? This project is too important. We're going to move forward anyway. You can convene the Endangered Species Committee. The Endangered Species Committee is been affectionately called by a lot of people. They call it the God Squad. And they call it the God Squad for good reason. Here are the 7 members of the God Squad: the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Army, the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Secretary of the Interior, the Administrator of NOAA, and then the President will appoint one person from the states that are affected, the one here from Indiana. That's a huge list of really important people. And the point here is that's not going to happen. This project is big. It certainly is very important to all of us, but I can tell you this is like a drop in the bucket as far as the feds are concerned. They could care less about our little reservoir. These guys are not going to get in the same room just so that we can have a reservoir, okay? This has never happened in the history of the Endangered Species Act. There was one time when they almost got together, and then they said, nah, never mind. So these guys have never gotten together and have never overturned a ruling of the Fish and Wildlife Service in favor of a project. It's never happened in the history of the Endangered Species Act, and it's not likely to happen for something like this. So, point being is if we summarize this, since federal agencies are involved, informal and or formal consultation must be initiated for this project. I've talked to some people, and it sounds like there may have been some initial conversations with Fish and Wildlife, but I'm not sure how far that has gone along. Endangered bats are known from the area, and if I had to put money on it, I'd say they are here. Now, I can't say that for sure. I've not been looking for them, but I would say that they are here. The habitat is ideal and perfect. And so loss of one or more colonies, in my book, now I'm not Fish and Wildlife, but in my book, would jeopardize the potential existence of these species. And so as a result, an incidental take permit, which is usually your way around these kinds of things, is not going to be an option for this project. So unless they can convince the Fish and Wildlife that the amount of animals that would be displaced and or killed and or lost of reproduction and everything else doesn't jeopardize the species, that would be an extremely hard sell in my book. Really, we're going to have an insurmountable hurdle here as far as the Endangered Species Act is concerned. For what it's worth, good or bad, this act is pretty darn powerful, and it takes a lot to try. We can't get around it, right? And so it's going to take a lot for them to convince the Fish and Wildlife that this kind of a project will not have that jeopardy effect on these species. So that's kind of what I've got for you.